What is your family's darkest secret? There was a child born on an isolated farm during the Great Depression. She was born at home with no midwife or doctor in attendance. The parents never registered a birth certificate with the county for her. She got very sick with a high fever as a young child, 3-4 years old. And there was no money for a doctor. No phone to call anybody. No car to drive her into town. And no neighbors near enough to go ask for help. The family treated her as best as they could. But she died after a couple of days. She was buried on the family land with no official grave marker. Since her birth was never registered. Her death wasn't either. Nobody knew she had lived and died but the immediate family. None of the, now very elderly, surviving siblings remember exactly where she was buried on the property. Just that her name was Violet. She was a very pretty blonde child. And she was completely healthy but fell ill and died over the course of only a few days. At this point, some extended family members doubt the story. But I remember my mom insisting that Violet was real and is buried somewhere on that piece of land. My dad still owns a bunch of Beanie Babies and is convinced the market for them will come back around. When I was 5, my mom decided that she didn't want to be with my dad anymore. My dad has anger issues, so naturally they had a huge fight. Since I was young, I don't remember exactly what happened. But I remember my dad grabbing my mom to hit her and my 7-year-old sister jumped in to pull my dad off of my mom. It must have been perfect timing because as soon as my sister got close, my dad swung the TV remote and hit my sister straight in the eye. She was completely blinded in that eye because of it. My parents said she fell. And she doesn't remember much of it because it was so traumatic. But I remember. My sister was bullied mercilessly about her eye in school and dropped out in the 10th grade. She's had a rough life. In Drew Gus and other issues. She's very close to my dad and I don't think I will ever tell her what really happened. But I do kinda resent my dad for it. Had an uncle who was a drug addict and major alcoholic. He ran over a postal worker with his car while DUI and was being sued. He was also deeply in debt. Buying apartments he could not afford. And he hid it from us the whole time. We learned all of this after he overdosed. Which hit us very hard. We never saw him high or drunk in any way. When we cleaned out his apartment, we found legal bills, notices of debt, stored away bottles of booze, most empty, and numerous empty pill bottles for painkillers. Except for a brief time in the 70s when he went to rehab for Quaaludes. He seemed perfectly fine. Did it all in secret. A secret life of addiction. My dad managed to settle the lawsuit but it took a long time. My ancestors were kicked out of a town in Kentucky for blowing up a church because they had a still underneath it. My grandmother walked in on her father having sex with another man when she was around 14 or 15. She never told my great-grandmother and somehow she never found out. If he's dumb enough to get caught by his daughter. She knew. My great-grandfather had 2 families that lived about 200 yards from each other for about 20 years. Neither had any idea the other existed until the funeral. When the priest asked the spouse to step forward, 2 women did. I've been told it was quite a scene in the aftermath. I remember going to see my grandma when I was younger and being told these people were my half cousins but had no idea what that meant until I was a lot older and my dad told me what had happened. How the hell did he manage to pull that off? Hell if I know. Something about he claimed he was traveling for work while he was with the other family. He did have to travel some but not as much as he claimed. Was also told he was not a very nice person in general. My dad remembers him vaguely and was not a fan to say the least. My mom did poorly on a game show. My dad didn't win on Jeopardy and has never really gotten over it. The show is a religion to our family. And he can never go back. It's my goal to avenge him. But Christ, are there a lot of Supreme Court justice, congressmen, and college football clues for a Canadian to study for. My great-grandaunt, great-grandmother's sister, had a son out of wedlock with a guy who was married. A couple years later when she got married herself, the new husband told her he didn't want the other man's child and wouldn't let the son live in the house. They abandoned a kid on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. No one ever heard from him again. My great-great-grandmother was a member of the Cherokee. She was raped by a white man, so she burned his farm down. I think it's badass. But my family thinks it's shameful. It's common knowledge in my family that my paternal great-grandfather was an asshole drunk. Died when my grandfather was 15, and then my grandfather decided he would hitchhike out to California. What most of my cousins don't know is that he was sexually abusive to all 9 kids. My grandfather told me about him once when I was about 17. Until then I never even knew my great-grandparents' names. He told me about the abuse in the least graphic terms possible. How their house had cardboard boxes and insulation, and they were considered worse the white trash of the town. And lived right next to the train tracks owned by the coal mining company. He told me that one day his dad got really drunk and somehow ended up passing out on the train tracks. My grandfather left him laying there to get hit by the train. He left town because the police hated him because he was a punk back then and wanted to charge him with manslaughter. He wasn't in a huge rush and it took him almost 4 years. But he made it to California. Stayed a month, decided he hated it, and turned around and went back to southeastern Kai. As a bonus, I don't have that common of a last name, and there are small pockets of families with the same last name as us along the route he took to get to Cali. So I think I might have a few uncles and aunts I've never met before. It is believed that both of my great-grandmother's husbands fought on opposing sides during WWII. She was Polish-born who moved to Austria with her family, where she grew up, and eventually married my biological great-grandfather, an Austrian native. In the 30s, as the Third Reich was beginning to build some steam, my great-grandfather supported the movement. My great-grandmother was deeply disturbed by his consideration of joining the Nazi Party, and over the span of about a year they clashed greatly over my great-grandfather's political leanings. Eventually my grandfather decided that he was to move to Germany and join the army, and he told my grandmother to either come with him and bring their 2 children or never speak to him again. This is where she left him and ultimately decided to come to America. Very little is known about my great-grandfather after this point, but it is believed he became a guard in one of Hitler's death camps. By now it is about 1937-38ish. She moved to New Jersey with her 2 children, and there she met who would eventually become her second husband. He was a Polish Jew who also recently took his family to America as they feared Hitler's oppression. My great-grandmother shared her story for why she traveled to America and talked about her previous husband. Shortly after the US declared war in Europe, for a lack of a better term I guess I'll call him now my step-great-grandfather, joined the US military with the hopes to fight for his people and liberate Poland. He was shipped out to Europe after his training, where he began in France and made his way east through Europe towards Germany. At the tail end of the war, my step-great-grandfather was among some of the first Allied units to discover and begin liberating the concentration camps. Here he saw firsthand what the Nazis had done to his people, and it changed him forever. It is interesting to think that it is quite possible that both men very well may have crossed paths at some point at the end of the war. So not really a dark secret. But we've got 2 kinda dark but neat secrets. 1. My great-aunt was arrested for having 50 cats and 1 dog frozen in her freezer. They thought she was a crazy animal abuser and totally nuts. But she was just a crazy cat lady with 1 dog. And during the winter the animals all caught parvo. If you know anything about parvo, it is extremely fatal. And extremely contagious. It killed all her animals. But since it was winter she couldn't bury them. So she put them in her large freezer in the basement until spring. Of course they still put her in a home. But that was probably for the best. 2. One of my ancestors was held in the Salem witch trials. He was like the 7th or 8th generation of his name. And to this day the firstborn son of each generation bears his name. He's actually depicted in the Crucible as well. My mom stole bread at a store once. It was like 8 at night at a Ralph's, and we go to the self-checkout and for some reason the machine won't let us scan the baguette. We ask the employees for help but they completely ignored us. So we paid for the groceries and left with the bread. My mom's excuse is that she was trying to give them her money but they wouldn't accept it. My grandparents were divorced when my dad was 3. His dad left and there was little in the way of child support enforcement. So it was just him and my grandmother. She worked a lot and was able to give them both a comfortable life. But some of the guys she dated were shit. The worst in particular was physically abusive. One day this guy came over to my dad's house drunk and started swinging at my grandmother. My dad, maybe 10 at the time, went and got his .22 rifle out of the closet. He loaded it, went into the kitchen and pointed it straight at the guy's head. Pulled the trigger and click. The bullet was a dud. The guy grabbed the gun from him and chased my dad outside, shouting that he was going to kill him. My dad hid and my grandmother eventually calmed her boyfriend down and left with him. A few days later the guy was found burned in his house after a cigarette had fallen from his hand while he was passed out drunk. My uncle went to jail for producing child pornography of his own children. I'm pretty sure I waited on him when he came home after getting out. My mom won't see him, but my aunt believes his lies saying that he didn't do it. The worst part is he only got like 5 years. If it is a secret, it was one that was taken to the grave. My grandfather was in WWII and a bit of the Cold War. He always said that he flew a desk as the resource officer, ACA. Basically the guy that does the paychecks, since he was an accountant. He also was an incredible shot with a rifle. And spoke fluent Russian, though he would rarely admit it. Make of that what you will. My grandfather apparently had one of his farmhands murdered because he abused my aunt. My grandmother only told me one night as I was driving her home and her sundowners was starting to kick in. No one else in my family has ever breathed a word about it to me. My great-grandparents ran a very successful brothel for people with extreme BSDM taste. Immigrated to the US with a boatload of money and started legit businesses. Died respectable. Boring people from the suburbs. My grandfather never served in a war. He signed up and never went to boot camp, but he was buried with military honors and whatnot. My mum's side of the family, excluding my mum, has many dark secrets, including but not limited to fraud, theft, child abuse and murder. I avoid them like the plague. Not really a dark secret, but one I like to tell people. My nan was born in East London in around the 1920s. Her mother married a man with the surname Cray and had her older sister before eventually remarrying and having my nan. My great-grandmother though kept the girls' names the same, as it wasn't the done thing to remarry and change names back then. We would sometimes ask my nan about the name and its ties to the famous gangsters, and she would always say quite abruptly, no. It's spelt with a C not a K. Strange. I always thought, as my nan was quite the gossip and this was very unlike her not to elaborate. About 10 years ago my dad found her birth certificate in the loft with the spelling of Cray. The only other thing we know about her stepfather is he was run down by a taxi in New York. I'd love to find out more information about this, as it all seems very odd. A family secret that my nan seems to have kept even from her own family. This story has been told to me by numerous family members. I've tried verifying it, but so far I haven't been able to. Anyway, here it goes. My ancestor lived in Scotland. Belonged to a noble family. The family had a castle and were, as you'd expect when you own a castle, incredibly wealthy. For old mate ancestor, this wasn't enough. One day his brother was out exploring the lands, doing whatever you did in 18th century Scotland. His brother's wife remained in the castle while her husband was away. Old mate ancestor decides to get things started with his sister-in-law. His brother comes home, discovers his brother in bed with his wife and is outraged. He immediately calls a family meeting to discuss this. As old mate and sister has disgraced the family, it's decided that he should be exiled to Australia, never to set foot in the family castle ever again. Off he goes, given a fair whack of cash to ensure he can find his feet in Australia. Several generations pass, the stories from family are always quite vague about how many, and here I am today, with the story still told at countless family gatherings. Oh, we have two. One for each side. Maternal side, my mom's family was very Catholic growing up. When she was 16 or 17, her mom, my GMA, moved back to her home state but didn't divorce my GPA because Catholics don't do that. A few years later she committed suicide. Rumor is she was schizophrenic, but also that grandpa is gay and she couldn't live with that. After GMA died, GPA lived with his best male friend, a somewhat flamboyant artist, for 35 plus years until he died. 2. Paternal side, GPA was a very important person in the medical field. Rumor is he was dating his secretary and got her pregnant while married to my dad's mom. So he decided to perform an abortion with her consent but accidentally killed her. Family gatherings are really fun because we don't have family gatherings. Grandpa raped all 3 of his daughters for decades and even made his wife join in on all the fun. Then their daughters all got married and had daughters of their own, and let grandpa and grandma babysit. Then everyone acted surprised when the youngest granddaughter complained that grandpa was molesting her. I guess I was just lucky that my dad made sure we lived out of state, so it never happened to me. Nothing is sacred and love is a lie. My father during the communist regime in Romania. It was a part of it. 35 years engineer then. He regrets it sometimes. But either you were with them, or you would have starved. Duck, that's hard. Yeah, I'm pretty sure my ethics moral would go out the window if I had a family at home that could literally starve. Not an easy call, but I can't say I blame him or judge him. My great-grandfather came to America in 1920-ish from Eastern Poland, I think. He was 14 when he came over and never spoke about his past. We know it was in the Eastern Bloc and we know he was Jewish. But besides that we have no idea. I've always had the suspicion that he was running away from something, be it the USSR or family. It's always rubbed me the wrong way. Edit. Thanks for the responses. I had no idea the Jews were persecuted in Poland during that time. My mom had a very difficult time with pregnancy, and has had a significant number of miscarriages in her attempts to have a family. There are at least 5 that I know of, and almost certainly more from before I was born and when I was too young to remember. I was the survivor of a pair of twins. My only brother was the sole survivor of triplets. We don't plan on ever telling him because I was pretty badly traumatized as a child when I was told that I had a twin brother who was stillborn. I'll start by saying the mafia is alive and well in New England. Anyone living up there can confirm that. They still pull the strings behind the scenes and still have a ton of influence. I'm gonna keep my uncle's second profession a mystery because RIMAS is one of those places where everyone knows everyone. And many will probably know exactly who he is cause millions have seen him on TV whether they know it or not. I'll just say it has to do with sports. Anyway, my uncle was primarily a corrections officer at a big New England prison and yay, he was on the take, receiving money under the table from the mob in exchange for special treatment for the mob related prisoners. Maybe it was forced upon him or maybe he couldn't resist the money. Not sure. But the 90s were one big party for him and he lived lavishly. Fast cars, big parties, and he even had a heart attack on TV after doing an 8-ball of coke. Fast forward to federal investigation. In order to save his direct family he took a plea bargain and sold out everyone. He walked and dozens went to prison, co-workers and high and low ranking mafia guys, etc. He also refused witness protection, not sure why. I suppose it's because the only life he ever knew was in New England. Fast forward to present day and everyone he sold out is now slowly getting out after serving 20-30 years. And he's been receiving death threats all this time. He had settled down and became a family man raising my cousins. But in the past couple years his lifestyle has completely reverted back to his old lifestyle. Basically because he knows he's dead. He lives every day like it's his last and we're all just waiting for his mare dare. Not nearly as compelling as most of the posts here, but still the most interesting thing in my family. My second cousin hoarded child porn and might have abused his son. My first cousin tried to kill himself last year after being an addict for 3. My brother's fish died the first night we got it and we had to go to the pet store and get another before he noticed. It's been 10 years. He will never know. This will get buried, but my grandfather sexually abused my mother and her sister, my auntie, during the entirety of their childhoods. From about 5 to 16ish. Some of the family know. Some pretend they don't know and most don't know at all. One sister fought him, the other didn't. There's more to this that I won't bore you with. When I was a child, I used to be furious that my brother was allowed to go into the living room on his own and I wasn't. I'm a girl. Then I found out that I was being secretly protected by my mother and auntie. His sickness, as they called it, was with little girls. He's dead now. Good riddance. I have a severely mentally ill aunt that has 3 children. She lives in backwoods Louisiana. And they haul alligators for a living. She pulled her children out of school when Katrina rolled through and destroyed everything and parked an old mobile home on the family property. She homeschooled her kids. She would rip pages out of the Bible and tell them about God's wrath towards them and such. They would sacrifice animals. Her kids cannot read or write. And one of them got a girl pregnant twice and has 2 kids now, roughly 10 months apart. We've called the police and EHS and all of that, but because it's a town of less than 300 people and everyone knows everyone, no one will do anything. Their home is absolutely filthy. There's always dead animals in the yard. Probably not a safe place for kids to be raised. But no one cares. I don't know the whole story, but I am not part of my family. Besides height, I share a lot of similarities with my cousin. He is now a lot taller than me, but as childs we were often confused. I look nothing like my parents. As a child having nearly white hair while my dad had black and my mom having dark brown. My features are sharper than my parents and brother. On a hunting trip with a cousin and my uncle. My uncle said something about talking to him on my 21st birthday if my parents haven't told me yet, so I'm assuming he will be the cool uncle and tell me. But other than that, my family has mostly treated me different, not poorly, but more like I'm a guest. My father died in 9/11 and 3 years before that he got my mom pregnant. He told her he was separated from his wife, but they never filed for divorce. Basically he had an affair with my mother and his wife had no idea until the funeral came around. To everyone else my birth was from a past relationship, but really it was because my dad had an affair. His side of the family refuses to acknowledge I exist and his wife wants me dead. GGWP. I'm pretty sure, but don't have concrete proof, that my cousin isn't my uncle's son. There's this waiter that works in my uncle's hotel who has a lot of the same features my cousin has. For example, my uncle is incredibly tall but my cousin is short. Same height as the waiter. My uncle and my other cousins have sharp chins while my cousin has a blunt one with a more defined jaw. And finally, they both have the same caveman-esque looking brow line with some sort of birthmark on their left temple. My mother psychologically, emotionally, and sometimes physically abuses me. My sister and my dad. My sister's moved out. My dad's in denial. And my mum takes great comfort in making me feel guilty about existing. She tries desperately to be the perfect Facebook grandma to compete with other relatives or friends. None of them know who she really is. It's gotten so bad lately that I don't feel worthy of food, whether I bought it or she did. She insults me so often I eventually start believing her. I sometimes consider posting on Facebook a list of every self-esteem ruining thing she's ever said or done to me. But how would that help? You can't change people. And this is textbook abuse. She's only nice when it's useful for making me feel guilty again. I'm moving out this month though. And I'm already working on being nice to myself. So maybe this is the end for me. My eldest uncle on my dad's side was murdered and we're pretty sure it was his girlfriend's brother. It's considered a cold case by the police. My sister has had at least one abortion but probably more. As long as no one openly acknowledges it, my parents can pretend that none of us have. I have a half Korean uncle somewhere in the world that I will probably never meet because my grandma made my grandpa burn all the letters from his Korean baby mama when they got married. My grandfather used to beat the duck out of my grandmother whenever she caught him in bed with other men. In turn, grandma drank and beat the duck out of her kids. Oddly enough, my father was never abusive to us. My mother slept with her cousin when I was around 4. No one knew until her and my dad separated for a while and she dated this super creepy guy and told him about it. When my mom and dad decided to get back together, super creepy guy was pissed and sent letters to me, my sister, my aunt and other friends of my mother's telling us all about it.